I'm Saundra Kelley, and I am reading from On the Drop Side of Yonder, written by Jacqueline Brunet. We're on Chapter 9, and this is about her growing up in the 1930s. Small-town America. One of our neighbors in Gregory had a cow, and I happened to be nearby when Mr. Hallett was preparing to milk it, and I was allowed into the barn to watch it. It was the first time I'd ever seen him milking, after which I marched home and told my mother I was never going to drink milk any more. She asked why, and I answered, because it comes out of a dirty old cow. One of our favorite summer pastimes was spent in Marshall's cow pasture. Janet Marshall was a year younger than I, and usually she was with me and my other friends when we played there, and we made up stories and played the parts. And a nice stream flowed there through the property, and that's where we caught frogs. Sometimes we caught enough so that we could fry the legs, and we became quite clever at snatching them, batting their heads against a stone, cutting the legs off, and skinning the poor creatures. They were delicious, fried in butter. My cousin in Ann Arbor always said she felt sorry for me because there was nothing to do in our small town. To her, Gregory was practically the end of the earth. No movie theater, no roller skating rink, no interesting stores to shop in. But I found plenty to do there. As a small child, I had my cat, Trixie, to amuse me. She even let me rock her in the big brown leather-covered chair. When she came inside in the morning, she went from bed to bed until she found mine, and then she hopped in. She was my faithful companion, as I had only a mild interest in dolls. Our house had wooden railings jutting out from two sides of the room that separated a small dining area from the living room, and they were just right to serve as horses for my brother and me. And oh, how grieved we were when Mother had them removed to make more room. Outside, we had a sidewalk leading from the front door almost to the road, and it was perfect for riding a tricycle back and forth. After my dad rigged up a tire swing and hung it from a branch in the big poplar tree, I spent many summer hours swinging, pondering, and pretending. After I learned to read, I could happily while away the time in my swing, and I would take the stories further and insert myself as a character. One of my favorite stories included me as Uncle Wiggily Long-Ears's friend. For those who don't know Uncle Wiggily, he was a rabbit gentleman who was often perplexed by the behavior of other rabbits, and also that of the world at large. When I was old enough to cross the road, I played on the school's big metal swing set for hours at a time. I soon learned to get out of the way of being smacked in the head by the heavy wooden swing seat, and I suffered a few whacks, which left good-sized bumps on my head. When I tired of swinging, standing, and sitting, and purposely flying off the end of the semicircle, I climbed the support poles. And at the top, the world gave me a different perspective, from which I could look down and see all the activities on Main Street. Some people drove cars, but just as many rode to town on horse-drawn farm wagons and in buckboards. Later, I went to the other girls' homes, and they came to mine. And while at Shirley's, we made believe we were all sorts of people, even tramps. Well, we were helping ourselves to green peppers one time in her dad's garden. We tied them up in rags on the end of sticks. And then we called ourselves tramps, the homeless kind. And then we hiked all the way up to Gregory's Central Mountain. And I recall how good those green peppers tasted after a long hike. Shirley's father was the agent at the Grand Central Train Depot, so sometimes we went there to watch for the 4 o'clock train as it came huffing and puffing and shrieking in. I had two experiences that weren't too happy to think about later. Unpleasant things happened there. The first occurred just as the train came to a complete stop, right near where I stood. The engineer leaped off the engine, grabbed me, and then he threw me in the air, and he caught me, and I was terrified. My mother had instructed me never to talk to strangers because they could be kidnappers. And in that brief moment before he put me down, I really thought I was being kidnapped. Well, through Shirley's dad and then her mother and then my mother, the incident was reported, and the engineer said he had never seen a child's face turn so white. The other incident occurred when Shirley's dad and she stepped out of the office for a moment. I was listening to the fascinating clickety-clicking of the telegraph machine, and while I knew I shouldn't, I made it click a few times. A few minutes later, an operator from some other town apparently clicked in Morse code, asking Shirley's dad if some kid had been messing with the equipment. I was caught red-handed, and I dare not lie about it. I spent many hours at our house, or at the home of Catherine's when she was in my grade, and her sister Pat. She was a year older. We often played croquet and other games, and we'd take music lessons and for a while tap dance lessons. Our parents were a little more lenient than most, giving us credit for using good sense in the activities we engaged in. One day we took a notion to board the train in Gregory, and we got off in Stockbridge. We were quite fatigued after we walked that 6 miles home. If the weather was really hot, my mother would often be coaxed into taking my brother and me, and sometimes others, swimming. We usually went to Jocelyn Lake, just beyond Unadilla. Catherine, Pat, and I, when we were older, we rode our bikes to the lake. Less frequently, my mother took my sister, brother, and me to Clear Lake beyond Pinckney. It was fun to go there because there was a dock and we could dive. My mother taught me to dive before I could swim. One of our family tales refers to the day I dived when nobody was looking. Thank goodness my great-uncle Will saw my little black head bouncing up and down in the water and came to my rescue. Living in a small town allowed one to know everyone. And while that could be a blessing or a curse, I suppose, I liked it. Well, I might not have known Mr. Denton, who was the blind telephone operator in our area, and also his son who ran the store, or his cat, and that the cat was kidnapped and let out of the car in Lansing and that she found her way home. One incident made me really proud of my town. In the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan tried to stir up trouble in Gregory. They burned a cross at a farmer's home outside of town, and soon after the members came into town recruiting. They apparently wanted the Protestants to rise up against the Catholics, but the men of our town stood together. 2 citizens, one Catholic and one Protestant, confronted the men and informed them that everyone in town had lived peacefully since the first settlers came, and they didn't need outsiders trying to divide them. Yes, I have warm feelings for my hometown. Who wouldn't be proud to have grown up in a place like that? Today's child could never fathom how different and limited childhoods were 80 years ago, and how drab the future possibilities sounded the 1930s child. An average country-bred boy at that time could imagine a career in farming, medicine, law, and a few other occupations. Most girls' ambitions of an occupation other than homemaker were even more limited. Girls who lived in small towns during the Depression years had to decide whether they wanted to be nurses or teachers after they finished high school, if they didn't marry shortly after graduation. Some snooty girls expected to be movie actresses, but the rest of us knew they were simply sticking their ugly heads into the clouds. My mother encouraged me to plan to attend college, but many mothers of the girls I knew did not. Cowboy movies shown in the neighborhood movie theaters gave both male and female children fodder for exciting dreams and aspirations that went beyond our narrow choices. And at that time, droves of cattle were still being driven long distances in some of the western states. So movie directors and producers brought their stories to the rest of the country on film. Cowboys Tom Mix, Gene Autry, Roy Rogers, the Lone Ranger, and others whose names I have long forgotten, and even hooray a cowgirl Dale Evans, all became heroes. Alas, none of us in Gregory, save one, had a horse. I begged my mother for a horse or a pony, but she declined. "We don't have any place to put a horse," she said. Actually, there was not enough money to buy one anyway. "We could put it in the woodshed," I persisted. I knew she had had a pony in childhood as well as the privilege of riding her father's work horses. My dad and his brothers also had a pony, so I pestered my mother until she lost patience entirely, and I had to give up the dream. My friends, mostly male, and I, with no horses of our own, played cowboys driving herds of cattle to market and chasing outlaws. We used sawhorses, and they were fair substitutes for horses, and sometimes a broom sufficed, especially if we were dodging the posse. At my grandfather's farm, located far from our home, I had a few chances to ride one of the work horses, leaving the fields after the day's work was done. My cousin Billy and I found some old barrels which served as almost perfect steeds, and we each took the name of a movie cowboy and played for hours. It was a wonderful memory. One of my best Christmases took place the year I asked for and received jobbers. Riding breeches made loose and full above the knees and tight from the knee to the ankle. I don't know how exactly old I was, but I was very proud of them, and not above strutting about in my imaginary role as a cowgirl. When I was 11 years old, a new music teacher, Claude H. Isham, came into town on Mondays and taught piano, violin, trombone, and cornet. A few of us had fathers who earned enough to pay for 50-cent lessons. I had a dented old cornet belonging to my sister, and I began lessons on it. I must have progressed fairly well because my mother mentioned getting a new instrument for me, and she consulted Mr. Isham, who made his recommendation for a trumpet and said he would order it. It cost $75, an enormous amount for our family in those days. The instrument was long and sleek compared to the stubby cornet, and its silver colors shone brilliantly. I could hardly believe I was worthy to have such an instrument. My lessons went on for 2 or 3 more years, but I despised the yearly recitals. Getting up in front of a room full of parents and playing a solo was terrifying, and my hands shook, causing me to do a tremolo I wasn't intending. I also remember one recital to which my mother made me wear a satiny-looking pink dress with a flounce at the bottom. I despised it. My solo that year was the Carnival of Venice, from some semi-classical piece Mr. Isham chose for me. If my few years of lessons had been the end of it, I doubt that I would have developed such a fondness for the instrument. Soon Mr. Flintoff started teaching band in our town. I don't don't think he was hired by the school, but practices were held at the school during the evening. Older people as well as school kids joined, and we learned some of the Glenn Miller songs like A String of Pearls, Chattanooga Choo Choo, and other songs the big bands played. I idolized Harry James at the time. Being a part of a band was so much more fun than private lessons. I recall that we played at a few high school dances. Mr. Flintoff went into the Army, and the band broke up. I'd almost forgotten another incident that involved my trumpet and me in those days. 2 different women who were my younger sister's age, 9 years younger than I, wrote to me a couple of years ago to share one of their most vivid memories of the Gregory School. It was the time I played taps on the school grounds as the flag was lowered to half-mast the day after President Roosevelt died. My trumpet lay fallow for several years, but I took it with me through several moves and changes in my life. I think perhaps my reluctance to pass it on to my firstborn child comes from the fact that it is a bridge that connects me to a time when I was neither a child nor an adult, but maybe a little bit of both. I still had dreams and aspirations. And you've been listening to Jacqueline Brunet's On the Drop Side of Yonder, in which she talks about growing up in small-town America in the 1930s and 40s. Find the other chapters and listen to them. You'll find them right where you got this one.